You're listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast presented by Smead Capital Management. At Smead Capital Management, we advise investors who play the long game. You can learn more at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.
Welcome to A Book with Legs podcast. I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management. At our firm, we are readers, and we believe in the power of books to help shape informed investors. In this podcast, we speak to great authors about their writings. The late, great Charlie Munger prescribed using multiple mental models and analysis. We analyze their work through the lens of business, markets, and people. In this episode, we will discuss a unique history of two members of Parliament in the mid to late 18th century that as we entered the age of reason and therefore also revolution. Jim Grant is joining us to discuss his book, Friends Until the End, Edmund Burke and Charles Fox in the Age of Revolution. A little background for our listeners on Jim, and some of you would know this, but for those of you that are younger, Jim started his journalist career in 1972. He joined Barron's Magazine in 1975. More famously, he began publishing Grant's Interest Rate Observer in 1983, which he continues today. I would just note that he is a prolific author with at least 10 titles that I could count, but I'm sure Jim's going to tell us that I didn't get that right count. These include titles like Minding Mr. Market, and his more recent classic in my mind is Badget, which he published a few years ago. Jim, thanks for joining me today.
Oh, you're very welcome, Colin. Nice to be here.
So I got a sense of this late in the book, but as I was kind of going through this, you're kind of you like history, you like the markets, you have those similarities with people like myself. But what particularly caused you to get into this story and tell the story of these two friends?
Well, I think it was mainly for the words they spoke.
Okay.
And the things they stood for, and the way they stood for them.
Okay.
They were extraordinarily literate people. And I understand that today nobody reads books. We're in the age of so-called oralism.
Yep.
Sounds like we're all going to the dentist all the time, doesn't it? or flossing continuously. But this was a time in which education was predominantly about literature, and it was about the Greek and Latin and Shakespeare and Milton, and people like Fox and Burke could quote these authors by the yard, as the expression went.
Yeah.
And the time they didn't spend, in classes, on the sociology of the National Football League, or of American history from 1996 to the present.
Yeah.
Now, not having to do that, they immerse themselves in great books and great words and great authors. And it showed, to be sure they were rather deficient in what we would call the STEM branch of knowledge, but it was not for lack of brain power nor curiosity about mathematics, but it rather was because of what was considered a great education was almost exclusively a literary education. And that's to the benefit of anyone who loves language and who gets the privilege of reading their words.
Agree. I don't have this in my notes, Jim, just so you know, but I like the idea you're hitting on because ultimately, and we'll go into the book here in a second, but I think you're obviously arguing that at some level we've lost that literary touch, or what used to be considered nowadays is referred to as a classical education, right? You read the classics and you are educated at a higher level in the classics. And then from that beginning of Western thought, which with these gentlemen really had what would be thought of as that today, you then go out and you build your models for the rest of life, whether it be politics, business, or, ruling a land.
Yes. There was plenty of specialized knowledge available. Burke became a very, very accomplished amateur farmer.
Okay.
And so that was kind of a STEMmy thing to do. And Fox drank a lot and played cards. That's not literature, but
it was very bro-y, as they say, right?
Yeah. And the books they read stood by them and with them, and indeed dwelled within them their whole lives. And I find that terrifically inspiring. You know, I myself, I never had one moment of Latin instruction, let alone Greek instruction. You know, I was very serious high school and indeed junior high and elementary school musician. I played French horn and practiced a lot. And but I missed. I regret not having had that grounding. But certainly that grounding was well nigh universal among the class of people who became politicians.
Sure.
And so one of the reasons I write the books that I do, I write kind of half and half, you know, half the kind of books that you will not find a QSIP or a ticker in.
Yeah.
That's about half of the 10 you mentioned. And I do it because in a way I'm a refugee from this age of limited vocabulary and truly uninspired rhetoric. I can name a politician in a very high place in this country who seems to like 6 words under his belt. You know, and I wrote about John Adams during the Clinton term when the moral collapse of America seemed upon us. You know, I said, get out, get me out of this. Yeah. So I got out of it nights, weekends, and the 4th of July by reading all about John Adams. I wrote a biography of Adams, which he became a lifelong friend. And in a way, I think the Burke and Fox project was a little bit of a bit of temporal escapism. You know, when you write about a different age, you get to see the present very differently, and you get to imagine the future perhaps a little bit differently.
Well, I agree. And speaking of Munger touched on what you're speaking to, which is he talked about, like, I never met Ben Franklin and I never met many of these people, but I know Ben Franklin and I got to know him very well through stories about him and his own writing. And I think that I think about that a lot. So to your point, I walk away thinking, like, I know Edmund Burke and I know Charles Fox and I know Lord North and I know these characters of history through your writing. So let me start out with this. Let's just start with Edmund Burke. Teach us about his upbringing and his family story.
Yeah. Well, Edmund Burke was born in Dublin. The year is not quite certain. I don't have the date at hand. It says it was 1729, maybe. Mm-hmm. His father was a lawyer, and Burke grew up in the Ireland that was subjugated by the English overlords, and these laws that had been imposed upon the Irish at the time of Oliver Cromwell were still in the books. Not all of them were enforced, but too many of them were, and Burke got a very, very full taste of governmental oppression just by living as an Irishman in Dublin. And he finally, when he came of age after attending Trinity College and, of course, excelling there, he decided to come north to London to make his fortune. So he was not so totally estranged from England or English thought or English politics, but he certainly knew firsthand what it was like to be under somebody's thumb. And Fox was entirely the opposite. Fox was the most cosseted, most indulged, most prized possession of an aristocratic family you could imagine. Try as he might, he could do no wrong.
Yeah, and he had everything you'd want as a child at the time.
Yeah, except a father who would not pay or virtually pay him to go out and sin. Here, kid. Here's 1,500 pounds in gold. Go to drink yourself to death. So Fox was an extraordinary prodigy, as was Burke. But Fox was a prodigy in all things. In drinking, in horse playing, in gambling, in the ancient tongues, in modern Italian poetry. Mm-hmm. in whoring.
You say that like it's a sport.
Like fencing or jousting or right. Well, it's true, and he amazed and kind of appalled the people in Paris that watched him go about his business of being a young dissolute. Why does he do this? What? So his father was just loved him to death, and he expressed his love by indulging Charles in some of the worst habits you could pick up as a young man.
Sure.
So one was kind of a middle-class, striving person who wanted to do something great. He wasn't quite sure. That was Burke. And the other was the most indulged son of an English aristocrat you could conjure. And so it's rather extraordinary that the two of them came together. Burke was a professed Christian. He believed with all his heart that Jesus was a divine figure, and Fox only went to church when he was a wedding or something.
Sure,
we probably scampered out early. So most improbable pairing socially and
spiritually.
Spiritually. Yeah.
So early on, this I think this is a foreshadow of later events in their at least in Burke's life. You mentioned while he was in school. This idea of like the protector of the helpless, or the idea of mercy, becomes a big idea in his life. You mentioned the Black Dog Prison while he was at school. Can you briefly tell that as kind of a picture of who Burke was going to become more of?
Yes. Well, the Black Dog Prison was a notorious lockup in Dublin, and the kids at the Dublin at the Trinity College were. They had a famously led famously disciplined lives of scholarship, Monday through Saturdays. But that didn't stop them on Saturday from tearing up the town. And Burke, oddly enough, for the future founder of modern conservative thought, joined in one of these frolics one night, in kind of an attack on this prison, which of course. Failed in its attempt to release the good bad guys, but it foreshadowed, Cole, just as you say, it foreshadows Burke's lifelong determination and dedication to the idea of justice. Mm-hmm. He underwent enormous personal vilification while he was in Parliament. To defend on one occasion to defend a convicted they call them bugger. So homosexuality was outlawed.
Sure.
And two were caught in the act, and they were brought to the public stocks. One was stoned to death there, and this upset Burke deeply, and he protested it publicly, and he was attacked publicly in snide letters to the editor of a newspaper in London, suggesting that if Burke was so keenly interested in these sods, perhaps it meant that Burke himself was married to a woman only for show. That was the sense of the letter.
Sure, so it was a front.
So he sued the author of this thing and got minimal damages and gave them away, I guess. But he did these things not because there was anything in it for him, but justice.
Sure.
I so admired him for it.
Well, so let me ask you a question on that, because when I was in that section of the book, I was trying to ask myself, thinking through Burke, did Burke have, I didn't get the sense from Burke what he said and what you wrote about him is that he wasn't saying like, oh, I'm all for sodomy, okay? It was the inhumanity of the punishment, particularly the public capital punishment that was witnessed, where you mentioned that they're taking out the public and normally they're throwing produce or stuff like that. and someone throws a rock and kills this person over sodomy at the time, okay? And my read on your writing was that it wasn't the act of sin that they committed in Burke's mind, it was the punishment and the inhumanity of it.
Correct. Yeah, he disavowed any defense of sodomy. He bought into that particular prejudice embedded in English law. But there was nothing about him that would tolerate cruelty.
Sure.
And he rose. He rose to the defense of the man who never knew, knowing full well what it would cost him in public reputation. Although I dare say, more thoughtful people, more sensitive people, rather liked him more for it. But
sure.
Certainly the vast public would be inclined to nudge each other with their elbows.
Well, speaking of, in the things that were left unsaid, Fox also had a stain on his family, and the stain on his family goes back to the person who let him get away with everything, which was obviously his father. You talked a lot about how it was publicly believed that his father, who became Lord Holland, stole from the king, throughout his time in service.
Yeah. Well, this requires a bit of background. And for any financially minded, investment-minded people, this will come as a most extraordinary chapter in public finance. There was an office called the Office of the Paymaster of the Forces. Mm-hmm. And the Office of the Paymaster of the Forces was charged with receiving public money with which to pay the salaries of the troops and the sailors. And the money was his until such time as he needed it to make payroll. Money was his, and he could speculate with it. You could invest with the Bank of England,
yep.
good 3 or 4%, or you could speculate in common stocks or anything else you want to do with it. And it helped. It didn't hurt, certainly, that the Office of the Paymaster was also a place where you could get some inside information on what the government was going to do, whether peace negotiations would be fruitful or not. And Lord Holland played this like a fiddle, and became extremely rich. So people looked at these hundreds of thousands of pounds sterling. This is big money. This is more than Donald Trump have ever. It's as much as Donald Trump had made in crypto.
Sure,
almost.
Wait, are you saying there's grift going on right now, Jim?
I didn't say that. Yeah, no, it's the same. Well, the two of them share that it was utterly out in the open. It was perfectly legal. And I guess that with respect to the president today and his crypto adventures, I'm not sure what the courts will finally decide or how the juridical record will be written. Mm-hmm. But in Fox's time, certainly what he did was fine. And although it never passed the smell test, and the senior Pitt, P-I-T-T, the great commoner,
yep.
Was one point the Office of the Paymaster. He declined to use the funds this way. He would not invest them or speculate with them.
Sure.
They stayed locked up in the Bank of England. And I guess I'm digressing a little bit, but Burke came into the same office. And wouldn't you know it, Burke passed a reform that cut him out of the big money. Burke was broke his whole life. Fox was broke his whole life. Fox lived from bankruptcy to bankruptcy. Burke's affairs were not much better, but he never actually had to face the indignity of having a sheriff come and stack his furniture outside of his house.
Sure.
In Mayfair.
Well, and the other thing that came up throughout this story, I mean, we're talking about people that need money, who are in politics. I mean, it seemed like there wasn't a single person in politics that had any money that didn't have a gambling debt or some kind of debt being held by, someone that they have patronage to, including, as you point out, the king. The incentives were very perverse in Parliament at the time because of people's debts.
Yeah. Well, the king was not. The king had a huge allowance.
Yep. The civil list.
Yeah. Well, yes, and he. It's like the joke about. I forgive the tone of this. A joke that makes this rounds during final phases of bull market. I gave my wife an unlimited budget, and she exceeded it.
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. That's the. The king didn't have an infinite budget, but he did exceed it.
Yeah.
And he had to go or have his proxies go begging Parliament to top up his considerable income. So, but the way it worked in Parliament was that you didn't earn a single shilling out of Parliament unless you held public office. So Burke and Fox both were on the outside looking in. They were both lifetime. Well, a few very minor exceptions. They were both in the opposition for their careers. So they made no money from it. And that put them, as you say, at the mercy of their creditors.
Yeah.
And Edmund Burke, was in the debt of his great mentor, whose name just now, Cole, escapes me. Will fill me in. Trouble with writing a book is that you write it and then
and there's a lot of names. I mean, you're talking about 50 years of names.
50 years later they publish it.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Cole Smead, CEO and Portfolio Manager here at Smead Capital Management and host of this podcast. If you enjoy this podcast, I'd like to invite you to check out smeadcap.com. At our firm, we are stock market investors. We advise investors who play the long game with a discipline that has proven success over long periods of time. Learn more about our funds at smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by Smead Funds Distributors, LLC, not affiliated. The other thing, too, that you illuminate is, at the time, I think it was about a third of the seats of Parliament were not even contested, where someone just say, hey, that's who's going to represent that area because that was the process at the time, versus there were other contested seats. So, for example, like Westminster was a contested seat, and you tell some of the stories of that. Let me pivot a little bit, because one of the main debates that seems to come up time and time again throughout this book for Burke, or I'll call it Burke and Fox with Parliament, is the idea of regulating commerce versus taxation. The Stamp Act, was an example of this. Why was that such a main debate? Do we just tax things? And I think of this in the American context. We've taken things like sports gambling and said, hey, let's legalize it because we can tax it. We used to regulate it. How is that a fair way of thinking about some of the debates that the British government had at the time?
I'm not sure there's a trade-off between regulation and taxing. What did they tax? They taxed, the colonies famously, they taxed tea. They taxed, there were excise taxes in Britain, very controversial.
Yep.
Hateful, even. Some tax collector would come and walk into your orchard and count the apples, and you would be done for that.
Sure. Very biblical, by the way. Sounds very biblical.
It does, yeah. And no income tax naturally. And
well, let's pivot to John Wilkes, because he was also another lightning bolt, I would say, in British politics and in the cultural history at the time. Can you teach our listeners about John Wilkes and why he became so important in the Burke-Fox story?
Yes. Well, John Wilkes was a well-born ne'er-do-well. He was his principal physical characteristic was extreme ugliness, and nonetheless a ladies' man. He would say that I can talk my face off in 10 minutes. Just give me 10 minutes, and
sure.
I'll charm that person. But Wilkes was exceptionally intelligent. He was one of these fabled readers and writers and conversationalists. He was the politically the arch enemy of the great dictionary author Samuel Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
But the two of them would sometimes get together and put aside their differences, political differences, and just talk about literature. It was something they both loved. But Wilkes was the very human symbol and he was the kind of the avatar of what we would regard as political liberty in a
Sure.
time of very, very aristocratic notions of who might vote.
Sure.
And the criteria for that very limited question the politicians would allow them to vote. So Wilkes ran under the slogan "Wilkes and Liberty." That was what he stood for. That's what people shouted when they saw him, right? And Wilkes was elected to Parliament, and he stood for things that the king didn't like, that the government didn't like, and they voted him. Parliament voted him out.
Sure.
And the people voted him back in. And they repeated this process many, many times until Wilkes finally succeeded in getting himself back in. And in the meantime, Wilkes formed a friendship with, of all people, Edmund Burke. And Burke kind of helped him in surreptitious ways with getting settled. When Wilkes had become, by this time, at one point, had become a fugitive from justice, and he made himself scarce by taking the Channel ferry. And when he came back, Burke helped him to hide out.
Sure. Well, and because at the time, if I remember correctly, the publication was the North Briton. That was a very controversial publication. And so I think you were telling in your story that King George and his lieutenants and, consiglieres would sit around reading the North Briton. They were like subscribers to the publication. And they were just waiting for them to cross the line legally in the publication. And you talked a lot about how the 45th edition was so important because it's finally the time that they crossed the line and the king went after them.
Yes. And Wilkes stood for the freedom of the press, among other freedoms. And at that time, you didn't have to step very far out of line to be judged guilty of libel and slander. And and they came down, the authorities did, on Wilkes's printer. Yep. Because Wilkes did not sign his own work, and there was a great to-do about the North Briton and about the idea of the freedom of expression. And Wilkes was on the side of the angels. Yep. We would judge it. So Burke at the time called the government despotic, were his words, according to what you wrote. And then I have a quote from Fox. Fox said the House was, quote, and speaking of the House of Commons, was, quote, the only revealers of the national mind, the only judges of what ought to be the sentiments of the kingdom, end quote. I mean, this is the part of the story where I'm reading this and I'm saying these gentlemen are fusing their friendship through their political views. Is that a fair point in this Wilkes moment in the story for them? Well, yes. Fox was at one point the most obnoxious Nepo baby with respect to class distinction and snobbery. He believed that there was an expression in American corporate finance around the turn of the 20th century, one of the railroad titans said, the only duty of the stockholders is to collect their dividends. And what Fox anticipated this big shot in saying was, in effect, the only duty of the public is to do as we tell them to do through the legislative process of the House of Commons. We speak for them. And they would be wise to heed us and to stop advising us on a course of action. That was Fox's view. That was never Burke's view.
Yeah.
But Fox was an insufferable young prig. In the early days of his public career.
Sure.
Which made, of course, his subsequent conversion to a man of the people all the more astonishing to people who knew him way back when.
Sure.
He made a complete turn in politics.
Well, on that idea, we'll obviously talk about the East India Company later, but at the time, you were discussing this. What did you have as a shareholder of the East India Company and rights? And you use a term which is obviously comes from like Lombard Street and many other writings on the subject matter. But what was the idea of stockjobbing at that time?
Stockjobbing was the derogatory term for speculation. And there were no laws against insider trading. It might have been condemned on the grounds of taste. Did it pass a smell test? Nope. Not then, not now.
Sure.
But you could, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you could not be prosecuted for it.
Sure.
So stockjobbing was about the manipulate. Was again a term used to describe the inside world of speculation pertaining in the middle of the 18th century, and that inside world would run stocks up, run stocks down, would do rug pulls, would play games with options traded in Amsterdam.
Sure.
It doesn't sound very different, does it?
No, not at all. Well, and also you point out that, while this speculating is going on, there's people, there's a lot of, discussion in your book over how they're trying to change the regulation of companies like the East India Company throughout these gentlemen's career when it comes to things like, the insolvency or not, the shareholder rights, et cetera. But while this is going on, members of parliament are speculating in the East India Company. So in other words, there's no rules. Like you can borrow money, you can speculate while you debate this in parliament.
Yeah. The stockholders were not without some recourse. I mean, they did elect the board of directors. They met once or twice a year, the stockholders did. But just as you say, the insiders had held the whip hand.
Mm-hmm.
And the incentives were not as they might have been for the best outcome.
Sure. But they worked for the insiders.
They work for the insiders to a degree,
mm-hmm.
But mismanagement ultimately redounds against the interest of everybody.
Mm.
And I think the best illustration of the misaligned incentives prevailing at that time was the compensation system for the young people who went to India to make their fortunes,
mm-hmm.
working for the East India Company, and they were called writers, and they would make this passage by sea, and that was like 9 months, and they would get off and into this most un-English biosphere, featuring strange smells and decaying vegetable matter and heat, oppressive humidity, like Washington, D.C., but even more. Okay, so, and then they would go to work for the company, except they wouldn't go to work for the company exactly because the company paid them a pittance. Instead, they would set up for business themselves. They would trade for themselves.
Yep.
And if they survived, and some of them did, some of them survived from the violence that prevailed then, and also from the disease that was ever present. And so the ones who survived and who succeeded in building up individual businesses went back to England fabulously rich.
Yeah.
And but notice that the stockholders did not really reap the fruits of the enterprise and the success of these young people. The young people reaped the success of their own efforts.
Sure. Well, it reminds me back in the 2010s of oil executives who got private interests in wells that their companies were drilling, right? Who's going to get wealthy from that? Well, whoever's collecting money without having to take any risk, to your point.
Yes. Well, the writers took plenty of risk, but they didn't share much of their well-earned money with the stockholders.
Sure. So another part that I think was, we start to really see a contrast, Burke's disagreement with the liberty of conscience. So this came up with the church. Effectively, the king and thus Parliament asked this question of, do the priests have to assign to what I think was called, 49 articles or 39 articles, I want to say?
39 articles of faith, yeah.
Correct. And it was they were being kind of pressed to this. And so this was a debate among the House, and Burke disagreed with it on the grounds that that's a human thing to have a conscience, and you have to be able to, act on your conscience. And at the same time, there was another very constitutional debate coming up, which was the Marriage Act tied to the royal family, in that I think the king could decree that you had to be 21 or older, and he had some control over the marriages. These were all real just constitutional issues that were coming to the forefront in what I will call the age of reason, if that's fair.
Yeah. Let's take two of those one at a time. First of all, the debate over the oaths one took of the 39 articles of faith. Now, to gain admission to Oxford or Cambridge, you had to attest to your belief in the 39 articles of religion.
Okay.
And most of the kids, not unlike they didn't know. It's like, can you name 39? No, they couldn't do 39.
Sure.
Could you mention maybe 6 of them? No, I haven't. I don't really know. But you believe in them, right? Yes, sir. So that was the way you got through that. And so the question was before the House was, should we abolish this requirement to the attestation to the truth of these of the principles of religion of the Church of England? And Burke said, no, we should not abolish it. We should amend it, nor should we listen to the priests who would rather not have to themselves attest to it, because the priests are working for the church, which is an arm of the state, and they should just do what they're told in that respect. They should accept that they are on the payroll of the government, on the king's payroll. Yeah, and somebody would say, well, why don't we just have them attest to the Bible? This is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
And Burke said, the Bible is the most miscellaneous book in the world. Interesting, isn't it? The most miscellaneous. It is.
Especially for a devout Christian to say that.
Well, no, but yes, but it's open it up. It's an extraordinary book. All sorts of stuff in there. You believe it all? Is it all relevant to? Okay, so Burke said no. So so that was Burke's line. Fox, said, no, let's abolish it. He was not one to attest to such things. So, I was
going to say, Fox didn't really believe in the morality or simplicity of anything.
Well, I'm not sure about simplicity, but he had a different set of morals than many of his age. So, so the Marriage Act allowed the king to say yea or nay to the proposed union of 2 members of the royal family and all of its multiplicity, all sorts of cousins and branches that went off from the royal family, and the king would have had, as the years go by, as the branches became got married, multiplied, and that the king would have a say over like 30% of the marriages in the kingdom.
We hope you're enjoying the podcast. You know, we work hard putting together this show, but we work even harder for our investors at Smead Capital Management. At Smead, we believe in disciplined investing, which is why the Smead funds have a proven track record of long-term outperformance. If you're an investor who plays the long game and want to invest in wonderful companies to build wealth, we invite you to visit smeadcap.com. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by Smead Funds Distributors, LLC, not affiliated.
This was a very important issue to Fox because his father was a commoner, and he married into the aristocracy, into the royal family. He married into the nobility.
Yep.
And the king didn't like it, and the king chastised Lord Holland, as he came to be known, for this act of presumption. And Lord Holland fought back and sponsored laws against the Royal Marriage Act. And then Charles Fox inherited all of his father's prejudices and all of his enemies. And he too took up the cause of abolishing the Marriage Act. And that was one of the sources of the great conflict between Fox and the king. Mm-hmm. Another being that Fox became the tutor to the king's son in the fine arts of living well without regard to many of the strictures in the New Testament.
Yep.
So,
or the Old, for that matter. Well, and I think even down to on that, if I remember correctly, Fox's girlfriend was a performer, but also a prostitute who the prince took housing with at times as well.
Correct.
I think Maria was her name, I want to say. Was that correct?
She was Mrs. Armistead.
Okay, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and people wonder whether there actually was a Mr. Armistead. But she was a charmer. She was very intelligent. And there wasn't much open to a woman at the time in her career. If you weren't married, and wanted to work, and if you wanted to have a life outside of domestic employment, there wasn't. You're not going to go to school and become a physician.
Sure.
So Mrs. Armistead became a courtesan.
Sure. The only fans of that era.
Yeah, and so fast forward to the end of Fox's life, and he was this time he was a minister in charge of negotiations with France during one of the periods of the French, the Anglo-French Wars, during the times of the Napoleonic Wars, and he and Mrs. Armistead by then were married, secretly married, because he made an honest woman of her. They went to Paris during one of the lulls in the war. There was a peaceful lull. And they went to Paris, and Fox was a great Francophile. He loved the French, he loved the language, and they seemed to love him. And he and Mrs. Armistead had dinner one night with Talleyrand, Fox's counterpart in the French diplomatic apparatus. And Talleyrand himself had married a courtesan. So they're sitting I imagine them sitting on a settee, the Talleyrand's and the Foxes, and the ladies sat together. And I think I quote somebody saying, they had some very interesting conversations about the people they knew.
So on Fox, I think this was 1779 in your book, he's such a prolific orator that you comment on the women that are showing up to Parliament to hear him speak. Was this just his, oration? Was this his speech? Or was it just kind of the full package of this Nepo baby, probably somewhat debonair? He obviously took courtesans and he was a great speechwriter and speaker. Was it kind of like the full package of Fox that caused these women to show up?
Yes. Later in his life, somebody made a disparaging remark about Fox in the presence of Fox's then political enemy, who's the younger Pitt, William Pitt the Younger. And Pitt said, you have never seen him inside the magic circle, which I think meant his rare gift for speech within the House of Commons.
Yeah.
But Fox was this extraordinarily magnetic figure. We have joked probably more than we should have about his shortcomings.
Sure.
Although he's not going to sue us, it's fine.
Yeah, libal's fine nowadays, right?
Yeah. Well,
for him at least.
Distance disinfects all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But Fox was, in some matters, exceptionally powerfully principled and fearless in defending those principles. He was a great enemy of the slave trade, and he regarded the abolition of that trade, in which he held played a significant role as the only thing that mattered to him in his parliamentary career.
Sure. When you mention in the book, and this gets into the Pitt period, but Wilberforce is mentioned in your book, and there's a great story and book about Wilberforce out there, who obviously he's known as being really the person that ended slavery in the British Empire. Yes.
I'm not sure how to divide credit for the abolition of the slave trade. I know that Fox, I think, held I'm not sure if he had a majority interest or a minority interest in that particular enterprise. But if you look through the records, I think you agree that his part was very significant.
Sure. The other issue that they debated was, again, these are all like what I consider things that we take matter of fact nowadays, but I mean, Parliament had to debate how to treat debts. So again, perverse incentives. It's 1776, and the House of Commons is debating insolvent debtors, and they're trying to figure out what's the level of debt that should be, considered forgivable in a way. And this is being debated among people that have many outstanding debts.
Yes. There's probably the most certain way to make sure that a debtor cannot repay his debts is to lock him up in prison.
Mm-hmm.
Yet that was the standard procedure, and it was thought to be black letter law, solid, well grounded in history and reason. But so the prisons were full of people who couldn't pay their debts, nor could they ever hope to pay their debts, except for the intercession of their friends. And Burke argued against this ridiculous, as we see it now, state of affairs. And I can't now recall just what Fox said in Parliament about it, but he can't. But Fox was frequently insolvent. As I guess I mentioned before, that sometimes his furniture was stacked outside his residence in Mayfair, and the sheriff had come to take his last chattels. You could not be sued. You could not be locked up in prison for debt as long as you were a member of Parliament, and Parliament was in session.
Sure, it's kind of like insider trading among the government today.
Who said there was insider trading in the government? Yeah, but Wilkes was made sure to be. He wanted election to Parliament because he was then kind of invisible to the long arm of the law in some respects. So
sure.
being in Parliament did have its benefits, quite apart from the monetary one, which was actually not a benefit at all, being absent.
So Henry Lawrence is captured off of, I think, Newfoundland with documents that incriminate the U.S. government with the Dutch. He's brought back to England to be thrown in the Tower, if my memory serves me correctly. Burke's in contact with Franklin because in the background of all this, there's obviously the war in the Americas going on, which is eventually lost. But there's this tension of really King George and how he's dealt with that, and how Parliament wants to kind of walk the path forward, which was very expensive. Franklin was a popular figure at the time, even in England. He was known as a philosopher and a thinker, and by the way, classical education. He's really the father of the modern classical education at what's now UPenn. How was Franklin viewed in the public, or how would Burke or Fox look at Franklin?
Well, Burke was friends with Franklin. They corresponded. I think had held each other in great high regard. Samuel Johnson said to Burke that his stream of mind is perpetual. That's Johnson talking about Burke. Mm-hmm. And certainly the same could be said of Franklin. He was always, he was never not thinking. He was, and the two of them made common cause with respect to the American Revolution. They were both interested in ending it, both interested in America becoming a self-governing nation.
Sure.
And Burke befriended Laurens in the Tower, again, risking charges of engaging in treason. People said that if you're in correspondence with Franklin, this leader of the rebellion, that makes you a party to the treason, to the rebellion. And Burke shook that off and denied it and denounced it. But again, it illustrates the many, many instances in which Burke was prepared to risk his public reputation and risk more than that. During the Gordon riots, I guess 1780, when London was burning with the riots of the anti-Catholic.
Yeah, the Protestants came out.
Yeah, and so Burke was not a Catholic, although he was regarded virtually as one by his political enemies because he was Irish.
And they called him a Jacobite.
Yeah. And Burke walked out into the mob and said, "Here I am. Let me explain. Tell me where I'm wrong."
Yeah. Let's pivot a little bit because we're kind of getting to the final scene in some respects. So there is a coalition. The coalition was North and Fox, kind of effectively running the House of Commons. The East India Bill comes, or what they call the India Bill, comes up. Very tenuous. Really costs that political coalition everything, and it falls apart. The king wanted it that way in some respects, so that's partly why it fell apart.
In all respects.
In all respects, yeah. He gamed the system to make sure it did fall apart. So then, this idea of impeaching Hastings comes up. He comes back to England, and Warren Hastings is, in effect, put on trial. And this is quite a moment for these gentlemen, because there is all this money stuff, right? Was he stealing? Was he using his position improperly? Did he cause war? Kind of constitutional issues. And then there's also the kind of human issue. I think Thomas Peirce, in your writing, he called Hastings' work un-British, which my take was he was saying it's inhumane, it's ungentlemanly, it's not noble. Is that a way of thinking about how some of Parliament viewed Hastings' dealings among humanity?
Yeah, not playing fair, I guess, is what he meant to. Let's go to the India business, the parliamentary business first, just for a moment. This shows the friendship of Burke and Fox at high water. This is the moment.
Which we're going to go from high water to low water quickly, though.
Yeah. But Burke gives a speech that to this day never fails to, when I reread it, sends shivers up and down my spine.
Okay.
Burke is on his feet in the House of Commons, and he is defending his friend Fox. He is defending a bill that would reform the governance of the British East India Company and lift the despotism of that company off the backs of the Indian people, as Burke and Fox regarded it. And at one point he says the following. He says, I'm reading this now, it is in the nature and constitution of things that calumny and abuse are essential parts of triumph. Now, he's saying that Fox is willing to suffer the calumny and abuse that are essential parts of triumph.
Mm-hmm.
And this has relevance to investing.
Sure.
It has relevance to investing because there's an expression that Grants has adopted of his own. We didn't coin it, but we know somebody who did, and we have repeated it. And that is that successful investing is about having everybody agree with you later.
Well, I think we call it the willingness to suffer. That's roughly what he's touching on.
Right. So Fox gets up and defends this East India Reform Bill, and in so doing, speaks this encomium
Mm-hmm.
to his great friend Fox. And the bill is defeated. It passes the House of Commons. It's defeated the Lord because
Sure.
The king has virtually bribed the House of Lords to defeat it.
Sure.
So the improbable coalition of North and Fox dissolves, and once again the two pals are tossed into the netherworld of opposition. And I guess it was never quite. They were never quite so close after that.
Sure. Well, because the next constitutional issue that came up was King George is not well. He is what seems to be losing his mind and going through a series of events that cause people to say the king is not going to be able to act as a king would. And so the debate comes up of his son, the prince, as a regent while the king's still alive. So he's not king. He is just the acting regent on behalf of the crown. And this causes a schism in Burke and Fox, because you have Fox believing, much like Burke used to, that the king is despotic, and Burke, yet in this time, and Jim, I need your take on this because this blows my mind. It's almost like I felt he was saying, in my life, there is something traditional about the crown that has always kept a sense of morality and sensibility and timelessness, and therefore it is needed in our lives. That was like my read between the lines on Burke, but was against much of what he said in his younger times as a younger man.
Well, I would say, Cole, that Burke was pretty consistent in believing that the British Constitution was perfect as it was, and there was no cause, no reason,
Sure.
no justification for tampering. Burke was, we know him now as the father of modern conservatism, and some of us revere him for that.
Sure.
But he was in his own time he was rather a reformer. He wanted to reform this paymaster of the forces business. He
Sure.
wanted to reform the way people were treated on in the stocks rather than.
Sure. Well, it's very Hayekian in that there's a liberalism, and I know that word's been very perverted in the modern sense.
Yeah.
But that's what Burke was. It's a liberalism that at one time seems progressive and another time seems conservative, if that's fair.
Yes, and so Burke was reformed, except with respect to the Constitution. And people would come and say, we need a parliament that is more responsive to the will of the people.
Sure.
No. It's fine as is. Don't this great organic thing of wonder and beauty we have is it's a pact between the dead and the living and the yet unborn. You don't just go fiddling with it for some perceived short-term improvement. Don't. That was, and people couldn't quite figure that. They couldn't figure either why Burke was supporting the American Revolution, yet he came to resist as a complete act of nihilism, the French Revolution. What was that about? But I think if a little closer reading of Burke's position shows you that there was more consistency than that seems apparent on the surface. He was.
Well, I was going to say part of their schism in the French Revolution, was Burke's writing on Marie Antoinette. You discussed her as a very kind of particular figure, even for Burke.
Well, this I call you're referring to one of the more notorious passages in Reflections on the Revolution in France.
Correct.
So Burke extols Marie Antoinette, and he describes her in terms that are almost erotic. There she was, this sylph, this figure of extraordinary grace, and I'm not doing justice as I could ever hope to do with Burke's work, but one of the readers Burke had for his book returned it to him and said, "Do not print that. They'll laugh you out of the House of Commons." And many tried, and many did. It was over the top.
Yeah, well, it was too much esteem for a political environment that, it's one thing to keep the monarchy, it's another thing to condone a revolution, or say the revolution shouldn't have happened. And I want to give you a lot of honor in that you talked about how the profligacy of the government was a dominant feature of the French Revolution, regardless of the, I'll call it the political virtues that also were being espoused in that.
The fiscal roots of to borrow from John Cochrane, the fiscal roots of the French Revolution, we'll call it.
Hey, I want to give a big shout out to everyone who's been working so hard on this show. We recently hit the top 10 in investing podcasts on Apple Podcasts, and even number 1 in the business category in several countries. As you may know, this show is brought to you by Smead Capital Management. Smead Capital Management understands how frustrating and illogical the stock market can be. If you're searching for funds with a proven track record, give the Smead funds a look. Or better yet, reach out at smeadcap.com. And don't forget to mention you're a fan of the podcast. Past performance is not indicative of future results. Investing involves risks, including loss of principal. Please refer to the prospectus for important information about the investment company, including objectives, risks, charges, and expenses. Read and consider it carefully before investing. Smead Funds distributed by Smead Funds Distributors, LLC, not affiliated. All right, so I would be remiss if I didn't bring up my last question, because obviously you are the editor and publisher of Grant's Interest Rate Observer. So I have to ask you, as we talk about like that to end on the French Revolution, what is your take on the economy? And I'll call it the Fed policy course, Jim, because the course seems to have changed quite a bit over the last 120 days, 180 days, let's just call it. And it seems there's a course we're on. How do you see that playing along with the economy? And then the last thing I'll ask you on this subject matter that you can comment on separately is just, where you see us in the final stages of a mania. But first on the economy and the Fed, how do you see this game playing out over the next couple of years?
Well, the administration, or more particularly the White House, or still more particularly Donald Trump himself, wants to subjugate the Fed to his own will, and is half succeeding. He wants a low rate of interest. He wants a very, very low funds rate.
Sure.
He wants that because he wants the economy to run hot. He wants asset prices high. He wants midterm elections to go his way. He is a real estate speculator by trading and promoter by trading, and he's a debtor, but he's a net debtor for most of his life. I think now with his crypto scams, he has come into the world of being cash flow positive. It must be a wonderful thing for him to be a net creditor now. But so
real quick question on that, because I agree.
Yeah.
Where do you see, so if we're on this policy to lower short-term rates, which there's no one to debate that right now, do you think we go to something like 2.5, 2.75?
Don't misunderstand me. That's what he wants.
Okay.
Right. So
what do you think he'll get then?
well, it depends, doesn't it? It depends a little bit on the rate of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And that's rather the wild card. So
it is the ultimate, Jim, it's the ultimate wild card. And I agree, because the knock-on question would be where that lands, so lands the 10-year. Is that fair?
Well, the 10-year isn't exactly the the slave of the funds rate. But let's say, for example, that Stephen Moran, who is Donald Trump's voice on the FOMC, gets his way, and we have a 2% funds rate. All right? And we are printing at not 3% CPI, but we're printing at 3.5%.
Sure.
It gets worse. Okay? So,
well, and by the way, most people, in fairness, Jim, most people think the inflation game's over. I mean, I think markets are debating that, but there's a lot of people, there's half the market that's on the side of inflation's not going to be a real thing going forward. And another half that says it is, and therefore we land at 4%.
Right. Well, there's always that, isn't there? That's why we have markets.
Yep.
Okay, so for what it's worth, I'm a believer that inflation will persist rather than vanish. Okay, so but if the Fed is going to push down rates regardless, and if the inflation rate is going to tick up, not down, you might see what we call a bearish steepening of the yield curve, in which the long bond and the 10-year, perversely, or not so perversely, I guess, go up in the face of falling short-term money rates.
Sure.
Okay, so that's one.
So call it like 4.55 as the lower rate goes closer to 3, as an example.
Yeah.
Okay.
Could be. Yeah. Okay. So what does that do? It means so what does that mean for the stock market? Well, it's hard to know because in the final throes of a great levitation in equities, interest rates simply don't matter.
I agree. And I'm with you there. You're preaching to the choir. Let me ask you a question. I don't think they matter to the stock market, but Jim, they matter to the real economy in a way, okay, more than the stock market. So let me just use an example, and I think this is to the Donald Trump point. At, let's just say, 3% on the short end of the curve, if you get a bear steepening in the bond market, don't you still want to be a bank in those spreads?
You want to be a bank unless you have exposure to leveraged corporate borrowers that may be unable to service their debts on time and good money. Okay. So there are many trillions of dollars worth of private equity in this economy. There are many $2 trillion or a little bit less of private credit, so-called. There are structures that are predicated on rates that prevailed in 2020 and 2021 still. And rates as they are today have tested the balance sheet strength of those. And you can see the kind of the bursting of rivets, as it were, in these structures in the prevalence of payment in kind options being exercised to service debts and more borrowing rather than with cash.
Yeah.
So I think that the credit tensions in this economy could very well spark a bear market that equities alone would not deliver in the face of rising rates. I think the story to be written is a story in the credit markets rather than the story of the Magnificent Seven.
Sure. So let me ask you a follow-on question on that, because all really nasty bear markets in the stock market are typically predicated by credit crises. In other words, I'm not saying that you can't have a 40% bear market in the stock market without it. I'm just saying it's an easier tell if it's a credit-related issue, and hence think of like a 2008, 2009. I think of credit being where that causes the greatest liquidity squeeze. That would be, historically, I'll use 08, 09. That was precipitated in things like mortgage products, and that was a lot of real economy, banks, et cetera. Do you see the same excess of speculation in those arenas comparatively versus in the speculation of crypto and the stock market and what I'll just call general degeneracy?
It's always a little bit different, right? And I don't see the regulators are very scrupulous about closing barn doors after the horses have bolted from one cycle to the next.
Agree.
So, so where are the next problem areas? And you mentioned some of them. I think crypto is vulnerable. I think my beloved gold bullion goes straight up for about 3 or 4 weeks, heavenly weeks.
Yeah.
But things that go straight up, do they keep going straight up?
No. Nope.
So what else is going straight up? Oh, how about CapEx for data centers?
Correct, which means cash is disappearing, Jim.
Right, cash disappearing. And what are these data centers delivering with respect to earning power yet? Nothing so far, right? Okay,
Nothing.
So what is AI as a retail product delivering so far?
Nothing.
Well, except when college is in session and there's demand for AI for plagiarism. That's an
unoriginal thought. Agreed.
That's a growing concern. But there aren't enough students to sustain the large language model build out. Just college students, stealing from authors. Is that in that? So I don't want to sound like the guy who advises the driver of a broken down Model A to get a horse. But typically, as I read financial history, in times of great technological excitement and tumult, that the financial crisis attended upon the overdoing it of the financing precedes the vindication of those ideas in the real economy.
Okay.
So AI will be vindicated in some form and fashion. It could be everything that promoters say it is, but what precedes that, it seems to me, on form, is going to be the comeuppance of those who have borrowed not wisely but too well.
Sure.
And all these great tech companies were great because they were prodigious, dependable deliverers of free cash flow, and now they're all borrowing to
the point of losing. They're borrowing because they're running out of cash. I agree. So I've Jim, to your point, when you're an asset-light business, you become an asset-intensive business. I haven't seen a good transition in that yet. Just so we're on the same page. The other thing that we've looked at, and I'm sure as a history junkie, anything that goes over 1% of U.S. GDP in CapEx, so like the railroads did in the 1880s, telecoms did it in late 99, and then oil and gas companies did it in 2014, I find really bad CapEx cycle, so that's not a good historical guide. And I think the other thing that kind of I was going to overlay another historical paradigm, the household ownership of equities that the Federal Reserve through their Z1 report publishes, it's the highest ever. And, the S&P from a 10-year forward perspective argues they lose money from these junctures. And so I think, and maybe this is like my biblical context, but maybe I'm in the Burke Grace camp. The people that have taken these speculative risks and made all the money, it's not the 3 bottom income quintiles. It's the richest people in America today and the most powerful that I think in a biblical symmetry will be punished, to your point, because the reward has been unequal relative to the economy.
Yes. I don't think the chastisement, to use another biblical word, will fall upon the backs of the bottom 48%.
Mm-hmm.
Bottom 48%, it sounds an awful lot like everybody. It's like every man.
Well, and if you're right about inflation, I'd want to be collecting a check.
But they may not own common stocks, but they will surely feel the loss of purchasing power on the part of the people who have been spending the money. Right?
Sure.
So,
agree. Well, that's the wealth effect.
They didn't get the upside. They didn't get the wealth effect, but they will participate fully in the downside, I'm afraid.
Sure. And my only other guess on that, Jim, and you were there, so you could give a better 2 cents than me. But it took a couple years after the dot-com bubble for the wealth effect to finally slosh over into the real economy. And that was, to your point, heightened in places like Seattle and San Francisco and South Bay and obviously Palo Alto, versus if you were in Houston, Texas, it wasn't the same thing.
Yes. I don't know the timeline exactly of how the this very carefully planned exercise in one segmented market.
Sure.
The levitation of house price. Greenspan and others publicly acknowledged they wanted to get mortgage interest rates down to get the economy moving again.
Yeah.
To infuse and to instigate more housing activity,
particularly after 9/11.
Yeah, which they surely did. shows you a little bit about the perils of a planned economy. Right?
Yeah, I agree. All right, so Jim, outside of your publication that we mentioned, Interest Rate Observer, where else are you active out there that our listeners can follow you or find out about your next books or become a gold buggin maybe?
We publish Grant's Interest Rate Observer twice a month, as we have for 42 years, and I don't see how people can't do without it. I tell my wife, darling, do you realize how many people aren't reading this?
I love it.
And we're trying to. We understand that not everyone reads as they used to, or as perhaps they should, and we are starting a series of live call in your questions podcasts with our friends, and you can go on the website and find out about it's called the Jim and Evan Show.
Okay.
Jim and Evan Show, yeah.
Awesome.
And we're having one in November. The witness is now going to consult his notes here. I think it's with Chris Davis, who's that wonderfully clever and successful mutual fund executive. And it's the 12th of November, Wednesday, the 12th of November. So you have to listen to that.
Nice.
Yeah.
I like it. And also Berkshire board member, might I add. So.
Yeah. Yes. And he's a board member of Coca-Cola Company. How's that for validation?
Correct. Let's see.
Nice guy too.
Yeah, Jim, I've loved this book. This is a fun read. Your book reinforces a powerful principle. People don't change over time; they change overnight. They change overnight; they change over time. And the friendship of Edmund Burke and Charles Fox proves that ideology or a friendship through similar ideas may not always keep friendships. Go out and buy a copy of Friends Until the End today. If you enjoy this podcast, go to Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to A Book with Legs. Give us a review. Tell others about the books and great authors like Jim Grant that we have the opportunity to understand and study the world with and through. For our tribe, if you have a great book that you'd like to recommend, email podcast@smeadcap.com. That's podcast@smeadcap.com. You can also send your suggestions to us on X. Our handle is @SmeadCap. Thank you for joining us for A Book with Legs podcast. We look forward to the next episode.
Thank you for listening to A Book with Legs, a podcast brought to you by Smead Capital Management. The material provided in this podcast is for informational use only and should not be construed as investment advice. You can learn more about Smead Capital Management and its products at smeadcap.com or by calling your financial advisor.